Awesome. We are live. As always, we are now live. We are Deboki and Nicole. We are here today for our September nonfiction book club. We've been doing this for a few months now, and every month we'll read a nonfiction book, either something kind of like sociology oriented or more like this one, something more physical, sciencey kind of oriented. The boundaries are blurry. Science is science. Whatever it is we want to learn about, that's what we're going to learn about that month. And that's what you're all going to learn about with us. And so today we're going to be talking about I Contain Multitudes by Ed Yong. But I guess we probably should start by introducing ourselves for anyone who is like new to this. So I can start. I'm, again, Deboki. I'm here on my YouTube channel. And when I'm not doing this, I am a science writer / communicator. My background's in biomedical engineering and a lot of like genetic engineering, synthetic biology stuff, which she talks a little bit about at the end of this book, which I thought was fun. But I guess maybe more relevant to today's discussion is one of the things that I do a lot every week is I write for Journey to the Microcosmos, which is a show on YouTube that is about microbes. If you've read this book and you are now converted to the Church of Microbes, if you're like, I want to learn more, I have the perfect YouTube channel for you. Just go to Journey to the Microcosmos and you'll get to learn more. And I apologize.
Like, even if you're not interested in the material, like it's beautiful and soothing and like, yeah. Highly recommend.
Yep, we feature microscopy footage from Jams and Germs, and so all it is just a soothing 8 to 10 minute discussion about a mind-blowing part of nature that you can't see until you watch our channel. And so I apologize in advance if I like refer frequently to writing that show today, because
every time Deboki mentions Journey to the Microcosmos.
Yes. I get paid for $0 for each mention, but after the fact, I might try to see if I can get an affiliate link or something. Anyways, that's enough about me. Nicole, if you want to introduce yourselves.
Yes, the multitudes that comprise me. I'm Nicole Sweeney. I am a producer at Complexly, which is the company that produces Journey to the Microcosmos. I primarily work on Crash Course, which Deboki is currently hosting, Crash Course Organic Chemistry. Do all sorts of educational content. I have a background in sociology and communications, so none of the things discussed in this book.
But in a way, what if that was sociology for bacteria?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. This is why I'm not a sociologist. All the sociologists are like, ugh.
Sure. I will say, I mentioned at the beginning that like going into this project, we had envisioned a much clearer boundary between books you would pick and books I would pick. And it has been really interesting the ways in which the stuff that we have picked so far has like kind of defied those conventions. Or at least interesting the way the first couple of books defied those conventions, but I feel like last month and then now this month we were like, no, this is a Nicole book, this is a Deboki book.
Yes. Yep, we went all in. I learned all about sociology research this month. Last month, this month we're going in on microbes. We found ourselves.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Well, so the book that we're going to be talking about is I Contain Multitudes. It was published in 2016, and it is, as it says on the cover, about, well, it actually does not say the microbiome on the cover, but it is about the microbiome, which is the community of microbes that live both on and within us. Some are in our gut, some are on our skin. They're all doing things. There's just so many of them. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. And so this book is about kind of like breaking down how that all works, what that all means, like all of these big questions. So it starts with an overview of what the microbiome is. It starts with like a very cute anecdote about a pangolin that's getting like swabbed for microbes. And then it gets into like the history of microbiology and like how that's like kind of drove our initial understanding of these little creatures as like threats, especially like when we're talking about as we transitioned into understanding that diseases are like caused by germs or caused by microbes. Like that really drove a lot of our initial understanding of microbes in a really like negative light, and like drove sort of the rise of antibiotics, which at first were like this really miraculous thing, but have sort of now become a much more complicated and sometimes bad thing, because we've driven like antibiotic resistance and created, through effects on the microbiome in a number of creatures, and including ourselves, like all of these kind of downstream negative effects. The sections that follow from this introduction are about like how the microbiome basically works. So things like how it affects the development of different animals. There's things like in, I think it was a jellyfish with like a glowy bacteria. Wait, squid, right? Yeah, squid. That has like a glowy bacteria. And then like the very conflicts that can arise between like the host and these resident microbes, like kind of how they're negotiating these things, how those negotiations kind of break down sometimes, how we even get a microbiome, like how do these how do these bacteria get in us? And also like most, like obviously in terms of how a lot of us like maybe first heard about the microbiome, the book gets into like the medical applications. So like the big one is fecal matter transplant, which is delightful. But there are a number of other applications in terms of kind of like treating disease at an ecological level. So I think the goal of this book overall is to sort of reframe our understanding like of our bodies, away from thinking them as like these isolated factors that belong entirely to us, and instead to think of how they fit in ecosystems, and or to think of them as an ecosystem that is part of a bigger ecosystem. So that is the book. So I'm curious, Nicole, as someone who has like does not spend all of your day thinking about microbes. I'm curious how you felt about microbes, maybe at like the beginning of the book versus the end of it. Like, was it constant? Were there things that changed? Yeah.
My feelings at the beginning of the book were null.
Mm-hmm.
Like I spent no time thinking about microbes going into this book. I'm being perfectly honest with you.
That's very understandable.
By the end of the book, to me, the thing that is the most interesting about all of this, and I don't know, maybe this is like unsurprising, but is like the way in which he keeps circling back to themes of everything being more complicated, that like as much as we want there to be really simple explanations for things, and you know, like good bad, like that is a false dichotomy. And like I in spite of personally having no sort of science background, I do work with, and like I work in science communication, sort of, I don't know, in a less obvious and clear way than you do, yeah. But I think that is part of the work that I am doing. And so it's like, this is a thing that I've been aware of kind of in the back of my head. And so it was interesting to hear it like confronted more at length, like the way in which he's going on at length about how much we are searching for like simple and concise answers, that like it's not like you're just not going to find them. My physical copy of this book that I ordered a month ago shipped yesterday. So I borrowed the audiobook from the library. This is the first book that we're doing for this that I listened to entirely on audio, and I'm like genuinely super bummed about it, because there's a really, really good, I've like filed this away so that when it arrives I can like flip through and try and find it. But there's a really, really good quote about this like halfway through the book, where he's talking about like scientists wanting this too. So like I'm used to thinking about it in terms of like journalists oversimplifying science, and like that's the problem, that it's just that journalists are taking like complicated papers and they're trying to drill it down to like a, you know, clickbaity headline, whatever. And like obviously like I am used to thinking about it in that way, because that's the thing that, you know, I have to be most mindful of on the like end, you know, like what we are putting out into the world side of things, which is where I handle it. But it was interesting to hear him talk about the ways in which scientists do this too. Scientists are also like trying to be like, okay, how can we like, what's the single answer?
Yeah.
There is.
Yeah. 100. I feel it's because it would make your life as a scientist so much easier too. I remember this came up. There's something I was like looking up for something about like the history of nutrition science and why nutrition science is like you always see these conflicting headlines, right? Like, this is good for you, this is bad for you, this does this does that, and like the same thing seems to like kill you but also save your life so many different ways. And so there's like this question of like, why is it so complicated? And like one of the things that I had found was talking about how like in the initial like history of nutrition science, the things that we were finding were so simple. We were just finding out that like vitamins existed. And so like though finding individual components like that like really sets this initial expectation that like everything's going to be that easy, but it's not. Like it's everything connects so intricately that like finding those few factors that are like so important is like actually on like a very small fraction of like what discoveries are overall. I was thinking about that too with the very brief section on synthetic biology where they're talking about how to engineer these microbes, because like some of these people are like people that I like know from my experience in the field. One of the people he interviewed was like on one of my committees early on, but then he moved and was not on my committee anymore. It's fine. But like they are talking about how like it's the same theme that like recurs throughout this book of just like how complicated things are, where they're talking about how you engineer like a single microbe, like you're engineering a single entity, and like the way that you do that is like sounds easy. Like you're just like, I'm going to put some genes. I mean, like easy is like an overstatement, like putting genes together, like still like you got to learn how to do it. But like, it sounds straightforward. You're like, I'm going to put these pieces together and it's going to work. Like everyone comes in like their first year, they're like, I just need to build this thing and it'll work automatically. And it instead like 7 years later, you're still in lab and you're just like crying softly to yourself because you're like, why won't this work? I wouldn't know. That was more of a 6th year thing than a 7th year. But like, that idea of things being so much harder than understanding one single factor was sort of like for even like just the way that like he is never drawing from one example either. Like you can't use one example of an animal to understand what the microbiome is and like why it's important. Like there are so many different animals in this book, so many different examples of these like relationships. Like it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think this like connects to the thing that we like comes up like a lot too in our discussions, is that idea of like understanding things like in a system kind of way. Like, and it's weird because again, we're talking about like that sort of like, we originally thought we had these like hard boundaries between our books, and then we like actually got into reading them, and then we were like, this like reminds us of a thing that was in the previous book, which reminds us of a thing. And like I think like in Superior, like Alchemy of Us, like Ghost and Schoolyear, like there is like in all of them the idea of like things are a system. Like nothing is ever isolated, whether you're talking about like biology or like systemic racism. Like they are all like part of a bigger thing. You can't ever just understand it by understanding like one single component.
Right. And like in trying to understand something trying to understand or address something as a single component, like because everything is a system, you will unwittingly like, you know, trigger effects like to the rest of the system that like you're in your efforts to isolate and solve for, you know, specific problem X, you are unwittingly creating new problems around the system as well. So yes.
Yeah. Which like, he talks a little bit about like climate change and antibiotic resistance, and it like made me think about like these are both like these huge problems that are so, it's not that they're difficult to communicate, but like there's something about the stakes of them that like is so, one of the like I think the con problems for writers in these areas is figuring out how to actually get people to like internalize the stakes of these situations and like understanding them, because they are so complicated, they are so big, and so like understanding your own individual place in all of that is so hard.
Yeah, and it's like the thing of not being able to understand like super large numbers. It's like that kind of like it's just so vast. The stakes are so vast that it's like I actually don't have like I can't process that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just I just finished reading The Overstory, which is by Richard Powers. It's this fiction novel that like was published last year and was like gotten a lot of acclaim because it is basically about trees. And it's a love letter to trees in fiction form. And it's just like about a bunch of people who, well, like some of them are like eco-terrorists and like just like some of them are scientists. Like it's just like about how much they love trees. Like at one point I was like, I turned to my husband, I was like, I think this book is about fucking trees. It's not. Like that's a very reductive way of describing it. But like it is about like this one specific part of nature and trying to get us to like understand how important it is. And it, like one of the reasons why I was reading that book is because a lot of like science writers have been talking about it, and especially people who work in climate writing, who write about climate science. And I think one of the reviews I read was from Barbara Kingsolver, and she was talking about how like one of the things that I think for her was really like meaningful about it was that you could write things in fiction that you can't do in nonfiction when you're trying to convey these kinds of stakes. Like you can put like a person's individual relationship with trees and really heighten the emotional stakes of it in a way in fiction that like you can't do. Ooh, I want more opinions about The Overstory, even if that is not the subject, because it's not. I won't derail this discussion entirely, but it's a book that I don't completely know how to process because it is different from my usual reading material, but I've been curious like how other science writers and people like working in the field like think about it. That is the thing about fiction. That again, separate story. Another thing that I thought was really interesting about this book, and like for me relates to a lot of areas of research that I've found really interesting, is how it like relates to how we like kind of define ourselves. Like I think an ongoing question through this book is like, who are we? Like if we like if we exist and if so many parts of us exist because of these microbes, and if so many parts of our body are defined in relationship to these microbes, what like are we just ourselves? Are we the microbes in us? Like there's the idea of the holobiont, which is like animal plus organisms inside of them. Like how do we construct ourselves as an individual? How do we define it?
Yes, I also this is like a like favorite I don't know, discussion topic for me in like social sciences, right? Like the social sciences ways of interrogating and questioning this, and it's interesting to me again because of all of the ways in which this feels like it's taking concepts that I have come to just like accept as given in the social sciences and being like, actually, this is also true, like all the way down to at the smallest levels.
Yeah.
Everything is actually super complicated and interconnected, and like the idea of so again, like tying this back to sociology, like the idea of like the individual is just so like complicated and messy because like you are a product of just so many social like and like systemic inputs that like it is super complicated. And so to then have that like applied, I feel like in my head I'm like, well, yeah, but I don't know, biology is much more like straightforward, right? But to have this larger explanation of like, nah.
Yeah.
Nah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I like, again, the boundaries between our fields are breaking. We're crumbling them in our live stream. So like, I mean, I know you said it's messy, but like, is there like a way to sort of like summarize like any sort of definition of self that's like, or like an example of some kind, maybe like one example of like how maybe someone, if not, that's okay. Like
that question, I need like a dozen more like specifying details.
Okay.
That question's way too vague and broad.
Defining the self relative to, I'm trying to think of words that sound like they would be remotely helpful in specifying in sociology terms. But again, my sociology vocabulary is so limited that maybe this is a bleak, because like I guess to be fair, even defining it in relation to biology is really difficult, because like one of the things that like my background also from grad school was like working on immune systems related stuff. And that's why for me, a lot of this idea of how we use our immune system to define self versus non-self is really interesting, because that is the function of our immune system in some ways, is to think about what belongs in our body and what does not belong in our body. And there's like all these incredibly intricate mechanisms to do that, because it is a self-sustaining security system, depending on how you want your metaphors to play out. Like it has to be able to monitor and process all of these cells that it's encountering in your body and figure out what are the cells that belong to your body and what are the cells that do not belong to your body, because you don't want it attacking your own cells. You want it to only target these other cells. But how do you do that? You have to keep a catalog of everything that belongs and everything that doesn't belong, or you have to be able to adapt that catalog as you go along. But like part of this book is about the fact that our immune system has like negotiated in some ways with like certain microbes and just said like, no, it's cool, like you should be here, like you should not. Like these microbes aren't developed from our own cells. They're not made from the same like original like set of instructions, but there's still something like about them that our body has decided like you should be here, like we're not going to mount a response against you. And that kind of like, yeah, like how do you define then at that point, like what is your own cell versus another cell? And like, do I just exist to sustain these microbes? Like, is that why my body exists?
That's what a fun existential crisis to have. Thank you, Ed Yong, for that. What fun.
Yeah. When you spend too much of your week identifying with microbes, you start to think in weird ways. Like I'm unimportant. Like they're the ones who are important. When we destroy the environment, they're the ones who are gonna survive and make the next thing. They made my oxygen.
No big deal.
Yeah. There have been times in the past few months where I've turned my husband and just been like, have you ever been really overwhelmed by all of the microbes in the world? And I think he's just been like, no.
No, actually.
Not yet. That hasn't happened.
As it turns out, the non-existent number of hours that I spend thinking about the microbes in the world
yes,
saves me from that. But yeah. But I take your point.
Yes. Yeah. So I think like if we want to kind of get into maybe sort of the craft of this book and kind of like how it relates to some of the things we were talking about with science writing. I mean, like full disclosure, like Ed Yong has been one of my favorite science writers for a really long time. The fact that I hadn't read this book until now was like actually kind of a source of shame for me. So it was like part of the reason why I was like, yes, we should do a nonfiction book club. Like it is for this book. It is so that I read it, because I've like had this book for years on my shelf and just been like, I'm gonna read it.
One day.
So like when I was thinking about sort of like what it is about this book that I like, I feel like this is one of those books that like there are parts about it that feel very like deceptively simple. Like it's just like especially compared to the two previous books that we've talked about on the physical sciencey side. Superior like has this very like, we're gonna talk about like race science, which is like not a fun thing, and there's like a clear goal in that. And then Alchemy of Us is kind of more on the other end, where it's more of like science is really cool, but we're going to also still talk about like the social constructs around it, but like it's more of like sort of your typical kind of like science is cool. But then this is even more to me of like a traditional sort of science is cool nature writing kind of book of just like, look at like you're gonna read this book and you're gonna understand the world around you in a different way, but it's not as directly connected to like, you know, things that we talk about a lot. Like I think we were like, when we were talking about this discussion, we were kind of like, this is a very different discussion, or it's probably going to be a very different discussion than we usually have, because it's not about like how the world sucks a lot. Like, I mean, it is, but it's not like strictly about that. So there's it's not about stuff that we like, to go back to something that you said in there, but like it is not about things that are part of common conversation in the same way that everything else
like everything else that we have read so far has at least some clearer tie, I think, to like a conversation that we would have organically.
Definitely.
Like I feel I have a harder time seeing how I read this book will come up in conversation, right?
I need to slide into Slack more and just be like, Nicole, here's a cool microbe.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is more of like a Matt and I conversation when we're like, oh, we're going to be talking about this. This is cool. Kind of thing. Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. Like, this is like very like different from like a lot of the conversations that we like would naturally be having. It's not connected to like a thing in a book or a thing on a TV show or a thing about the world or like how we should be engaging with like a media thing or like a thing we've been learning. It's more of just like, this is your body and this is the nature thing. And so I think like when I was thinking about what sort of kind of like why this book like feels in some ways sort of deceptively simple, it's sort of like because of all the like any book that is like this, that like for me at least is like fun to read and I learn a lot. Like it is very easy to just be like, yeah, it's a good book, and then for me to walk away and like be like, yeah, cool, and then like feel like, you know, that's all. But like a lot of times things that are written to feel that way, there's like so much work that goes into it. And so I was like thinking about what I think are some of the key challenges that go into writing a book like this, and that I think are common to like a lot of science writing and like a lot of writing in general, but like thinking about maybe specifying it in the context of science writing. And some of the things that I was thinking about, it has to cover a lot of like biological history and a lot of scientific history, like without completely glossing over anything. It has to not oversell something that has a lot of hype, but still be able to convey why it's exciting. It has to not be boring. Like it has to actually be enjoyable to read. And it also has to kind of like change our view of ourselves without like, I don't know, feeling like, again, like it's overstating anything that it's doing. And there were a lot of ways in which I was like really into how well this book kind of approaches a lot of that. One of the things that I've sort of noted is just like the breadth of stories that are in here. Like just like the scope of research in this book is a lot. There's a lot of different animals. There are a lot of different types of microbiologists. There's a lot of different types of scientists going on. And I think he had spent about like a decade writing about microbes, and that kind of shows to me in that sense. But like even when you are covering such a wide field, like even harder than is figuring out like you got to cut things out. Like that is also really remarkable to me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This is the point that came up in our pre-discussion yesterday. But yeah, you pointing out that like there being a wide range of things. I said this yesterday, we'll repeat now, but that would not have occurred to me as like a takeaway, like as like a thing. I just did not notice this. I was about halfway through the book, having now finished it. Like I was more mindful of it because you pointed it out at my like halfway point. So then like, you know, the second half of the book, I was like, okay, yes, I do. I see what is going on here in terms of that. I see that happening. And like, it's interesting because it's the kind of thing too, where like you have to, knowing what to cut out, and also just like knowing where to look in terms of all of this, like diversity of things, you know, like knowing to check, here is where my own like language and knowledge is also very, very limiting, but like that's also very much my point. Like I wouldn't didn't notice that there was like a breadth of things until you pointed it out. But then even having it pointed out to me, like as we're clicking through, it's like, yes, the fact that you knew to connect these two threads in the first place is in and of itself like really interesting and impressive.
Yeah, it's sort of like that, like just figuring out how to structure all of these different, like there's so many stories. And I found Ed Yong's writing when I was like in grad school and like considering a career in science writing. And like, it was the sort of thing where it's like, I read an article and then read another article and like kept reading articles and then kept realizing like, oh, they're all by the same guy. Like there is a connection.
Have one thing in common.
Yeah. Wild how that happens. And so there's a lot of like individual stories in here that feel like they're all their own article, like, but that they're strung together in ways that are like thematically like connected really effectively for me, where it's like, okay, I see why you, like you're saying, like you put these two things together, or like these three things together, like what is like everything that you're trying to link together here. A really minor detail that I noticed and I also really appreciated is that he acknowledges students who do work.
Yes.
Because like everyone always asks, like, it's the PI. It's not. Like, it's the grad students. It's the postdocs. They're the ones who drive the science.
Yes, not being as steeped in it as you are, that is something that I noticed too. Like the degree to which, and it's like it's never belabored, because it's not the point of the book. Like he's not spending a ton of time like talking about the structure of it, but it is clear from how often it comes up. I don't know. There's like a meta level to it of like it's not an individual like that. We cite the individual like academic, but really it was like a system. There's a whole team of people that worked together and like in these ways. And he did a really good job of just sort of casually weaving in the places where there's like a team of people that help find this information.
Yeah, and he's written also more generally when it comes to like finding sources. He's written about making sure that he keeps track of all of his sources so that he's not always citing men. And like that's the thing he like speaks about. Like I you can probably Google it. I don't have like the article at hand, but that's like a thing that in general with science writing, I think it's like a huge challenge because your first priority is always like finding experts, and obviously because of like
oh, I read this is the story in the Atlantic. I read this 2 years ago. Yes.
Yeah. It's so you've read Ed Yong's work.
I remember this.
Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah, and so I think it's like about like, again, like there's the system stuff like more generally, but like also specifically in science writing, like the importance of like acknowledging work from so many different people, and also being like really conscious of who you're citing. And like, especially if you want to be able to cite more diversely, like maybe part of it is going to be that you don't either cite the most expected person, or you like put work into citing other people or finding other people and like building up your database, because also that informs who other people are going to end up citing downstream, because they're going to see like, you know, you interviewed this person, they're going to remember that they were a source for you. Like if they read your article, they need to find a source. Like these things always like build on each other. So that's like a thing that I really like, the just the minutia of like making sure to acknowledge. And he like actually put it in his acknowledgement section, and he still was like, I still couldn't credit you all. I'm so sorry. And I was like, that's good. It's appreciated. Another thing that I really liked too, that I didn't notice until I got to like 75% of the way through, and now like I almost want to go back and see if it comes up, is the ways that he actually like acknowledges language itself in the book. Like there are times where he talks about like the metaphors that we use, like especially related to the immune system. He's like specifically saying like our metaphors around it are changing. And there's like a little bit, now I'm forgetting the other example I had. I need to remember to put bookmarks. Oh yeah, there's like when he's talking about like the language we have around probiotics, and how like that word in like a lot of the ways that we talk about it are meaningless. He also, when he's talking about the synthetic biologists, he like notes that their language around it is really around their work, and like how they're talking about genes is really clinical. And that was all really interesting to me, because I think people think of science also as something that gets communicated in a really flat way, like that. And this is connected to that idea of like objective kind of nature of science, when really like science has its multiple languages, like depending on what field you're in, and like that will already change your language. The way you talk about things will change, but then also the way we talk about science in metaphors and everything, like that is always consciously like being done, or maybe even subconsciously, like, which I thought, I mean, obviously just like as a writer, like he'll probably notice it, but I like the way that he integrated it here and related it to sort of like I think maybe the reason why I'm thinking about this too in the context of our discussions here and in general is how it connects to maybe an idea of like literacy around science journalism and like thinking critically, not just about the science, but about how we're talking about the science.
Yeah, I did not notice that, but yes, I also think like the degree to which he obviously thinks about language is clear in just like how you mentioned this previously in terms of the challenges of this book, but speaking as a person who came into this knowing nothing, I think that he did do a really good job of making it accessible without feeling to me like he was oversimplifying it. Like I didn't come away, like I felt like I understood what I needed to understand about all of the, about his various examples and anecdotes and stuff without feeling, while also being like, obviously there's a lot more going on here. Like we're just getting to like the details that I need to get in order to understand like where we're going with this. And I think, I don't know, like that is such a simple thing, but also such a hard thing. It's very much, it is, I don't know, every like craft or job or what have you has these things, like the parts of it where if you're doing it well, it makes it seem like you haven't done anything at all. It's that, like, this is one of those kinds of things where the efficacy is entirely in making it seem as though you've done nothing, like that it's just natural.
Anytime I come out of a book feeling like I could have written that, I'm like, you were wrong.
Good job.
If you coulda, you woulda. I think that, like, I mean, I remember reading a book last year where like it made me think about that a lot, especially the balance between like being informative without being condescending about it. And I feel like that is like such a, like, it's especially when you're trying to explain jargon, and a lot of science writers, I think, or not a lot, but like I think like one way to do that is you like really handhold people's way through something really complicated. But like you can do that to a degree where the reader themselves become really self-conscious that that is a thing you're doing. And like that, I think, is a thing that I appreciated here too, whereas like I never felt like he was like, okay, and now come along, like we're gonna work our way through this, like, and I think I'm sensitive to it too in books where like I feel like I have the background, so I'm just like, just get to the point, so like it's one of those complaints that I'm always trying to figure out, like, to what extent is it valid, because like, if I have a background, like that's fine, that's not the author's fault, like they're still trying to explain it to other people who aren't me, so like I should not be self-centered about that, but like I still think there's a way it can be done much more effectively. And that's why I think
this is on Crash Course, this is my like particular one of my like standout least favorite genres of comments. I mean, there's like a lot of them, but relevant to this conversation, there's a genre of comments that are like, this is grossly oversimplifying the topic. I did my PhD in this and blah blah blah, and I'm like, okay, well, and so like there's a level at which you're trying to understand, okay, is the issue that this is condescending, or is the issue that this is just not like that I am not the intended audience of the thing and whatnot. But I definitely did not feel at any point like I was being talked down to as he was explaining things. It was just like, this person made this discovery and it was this and this and this. I think that language actually maybe is also part of it too, that like, and then this person noticed this, has a way of like, even if you already know what this is in the context of the thing, it's not me, it's not like Ed Yong telling you, here's how this works. It's, and then this scientist noticed this thing, right? And so that has a way of, I don't know, of bypassing that a little bit.
I really like the way he kind of like inserted you into that feeling of discovery, and I think it helps too. Like he's, again, related to the example he's picking. He's picking these like weird wasps with nematodes in them, and you're just like, what, right? And like, who notices this? Like these people do.
Stealing poop from the zoo.
I liked how their like bureaucracy is always like, again, another recurring theme, bureaucracy. It is the worst. Yeah, I think like this is a part of the conversation that I think is really interesting to me, given that we both work in the same field, but like from different like vantage points of it. Like that idea of simplification is, I think, such a common, like when it comes to like people's difficulty, like especially coming like from the scientist side, like people's difficulty with science writing. Like sometimes it's about the overselling, sometimes it's about the oversimplification, but like it's so hard to get across like what the actual goal is that you're trying to accomplish with science writing versus like what, like when you're on, like especially if it's like something about something related to what you've worked on, where your goal is like so narrow that like of course what you're actually interested in is like this very niche thing that is not necessarily like an obvious part of the bigger picture, but like you want to like caveat everything, like everything you're just like, okay, but actually here's 3 more paragraphs about like this other thing.
It's like, no, you got like that's this isn't the space for that. But, like, it's really hard to figure that out, like to figure out what are the things that have to go.
Yeah.
It's not straightforward or simple.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, so because you worked on sociology and like, but also work on all of these other ones that are not from your field. Do you feel like it's easier to do that with the ones that are not from like your field versus ones that like are more related to things you know?
Well, so Crash Course is a bad example bad way for me to answer this, just because of the nature of what I do on Crash Course.
Yeah.
Is mostly just like facilitating other people.
Yeah.
I think, but I will say that for the couple of times that I have written for stuff that we've done, that yes, like as a general rule, the more that you know about a thing, often like the harder it is. The first time that I was given like a writing assignment at work, Hank said something to me to the effect of like, once you know too much about a subject, you forget the thing that made it interesting to you in the first place. Forget what that first thing was.
Yeah.
And when you lose sight of the, like, you've now discovered all of these other things that are fascinating, but they're fascinating to you in part because of all of the other things that you learned in order to get to those things. And like what you really want to communicate, at least for the kinds of things that we do, usually we're trying to focus on that first thing, like what was the thing that made the subject interesting to you in the first place, and like building out that story. So yeah, I definitely do think like it's a really, really hard line, because you have to know more than what you're putting in, right? Like,
yeah.
You have to actually know more about the subject than the confines.
Yeah.
As you well know, I'm sure. Like, but also, at what point have you gone too far? At what point?
Yeah. Part of the fun for me about Journey to the Microcosmos is like it's a huge shift for me personally in how I see microbes, because coming from the genetic engineering, synthetic biology side, especially someone who's working on engineering like human immune cells, for me, microbes are either things that the cells that I'm working with would be fighting against, tools to make the constructs that I am using, like we're using bacteria to actually piece DNA together, like they are just our own little factories, or microbes are the source of like information, like of like genes that I am going to be rewiring in ways to use for my project. So they're like either really something that I just like want to, or in all of these cases, they're just the thing I want to use. Like they're just like there for me to like take from. And so they're just like, it's a mass. Like bacteria, like I worked next door to a yeast lab, so like there's like it was cool because everything smells like beer and bread there. Like that's pretty awesome. And so like the extent to which I like came to understand other microbes, it was still through other people's like use of them. But like we're moving over to microcosmos, especially as someone who's like, full disclosure, it was like not maybe super up on everything I should be up on when it comes to understanding like the climate and ecology, like all of those things. Like microbes have been such an interesting like into all of these other different parts of the world that for me as someone like who's like I didn't necessarily come into science from like a ooh, nature is cool kind of place. I came into it because it was like, ooh, like this thing sounds like the immune system sounds cool to me, but not like I love to go outside and look at the trees, right? Like I think like if we're kind of putting a dichotomy in how people get into science, like my path is more on the like I read a book and heard about a cool thing in my body, you know? Or also like my parents are nerds and like they raised me on these as stories. Like these are my bedtime stories. But like,
and you're the product of a lot of different input.
Yeah, exactly. And so like one of the things that like is really, really cool about Microcosmos, and like every time we work on a new episode, I feel like I'm learning like something like very wild about the world. And like sometimes the ones that I'm like, oh, this sounds like whatever, I'll get into it. I'll be like, oh shit, this like fundamental thing about nature that I thought I had a good handle on, like is actually super complicated. Like we did an episode about like the evolution of sex, and like that was like very wild. Like, and that was just like, you narrow down into like, I narrowed down into like just amoeba, like the history of evolution of sex in amoeba. And even that is like wild and all over the place because some of them evolved sex but then lost it, and like why would you like decide that you don't want to have sex anymore, like what is going on, right? Like it was just very, very wild. And that like keeps coming up for me, and like yeah, microbes are really cool. Like now yes. The point of today's episode is that microbes are wild. Like this was like going back to the overstory. My feeling reading that was like, yeah, trees are pretty sweet, but have you heard about microbes? Presumably he has, but yeah. Let's see, anything else we wanted to get into? Oh, so another thing I just like wanted to briefly touch on, because we talked about this as sort of like a science is fun book, but I did want to note for people, if you did read this book or if you're like curious about Ed Yong's writing, he has done a number of articles about the pandemic for The Atlantic, that I also have yet to read, but like have started reading. They're very like in-depth and long, and like a lot of people have been talking about them because I think that part of the thing that is really great about being able to write things a little bit longer, whether it's a book or a longer in-depth like long-form piece, is being able to cover these kinds of intricacies that are super important to understanding things like a pandemic. And so that was something else I was thinking about like briefly, was just like the fact that a lot of the things that I liked about this book, like I understand, like, you know, the context of this book is like, this is a cool thing. It will help you understand important things about the world, but mostly it's a cool thing. But like that the skills that are involved in that are also super important, like in other contexts, like understanding a pandemic and conveying the complications of a thing that crosses social issues and biological issues and political issues and all of these things. So that's all I think I have to say.
Same.
Cool. So if anyone wants to like add some questions, we can do our sort of like
wrapping up all of that jazz. Yes. Questions, comments, other thoughts that you had about this book that you are shocked and horrified that we did not discuss.
Yep. And thoughts about the overstory. Also happy to derail.
While we're here.
Yep. Part 2, fiction book club. My thoughts on that. Yeah. I did it.
That's what we're doing now, yes?
Yes. Did you like it? Did I like it? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay. I really enjoyed this book. It stood up to everything I was hoping it would be and more.
How disappointing would it have been if you didn't like this book?
I know. That would have been really, really bad. It would have just been like an hour of like, don't read your heroes' books. Don't meet your heroes, don't read their books.
Don't believe in things, you're going to be let down.
Yeah. It would be a huge plot twist if after that whole discussion, I was like, actually, part 2 is everything I hate about this book, you guys. Second plot twist. I forgot, I was like going to just like add something on here, but I don't know. Yeah, cool. Anyways, how did you feel about the book?
I also enjoyed it. Yeah, like I said, I just don't have strong feelings about it. but that's more because my like general interest in the subject matter. I guess I will say wasn't like transformed by this reading experience. Like that would I think like the best case scenario for this book for me would have been to come out of it and been like, damn, I do love microbes.
Yeah. Very understandable.
That would have been like the peak sort of thing that this book could have done.
Yeah.
I didn't quite do that, but I did enjoy it. I appreciated it, and I feel like at some point I will probably there's like a non-zero chance that I will actually reread this.
Yeah.
Surprising to me, but because I feel like I didn't get this was not I am still disappointed about the fact that I only read this on audio like that. Like that experience felt incorrect to me and was frustrating. So at some point, maybe next year, not like in the near term future, but maybe next year I might like sit down and read the physical book that I purchased.
I still can't believe it took this long. Like it just like didn't even ship?
No, it didn't even ship. In fact, I checked it yesterday too, and it still actually technically is like they just sent me the tracking number, not like it's not actually like the tracking number says it's on its way to like it's fine.
Rude.
It's fine.
Wow.
I have been betrayed, but it's fine.
Oh, Jocelyn, if you ever want to sit down and talk about microbes, if you want to send me your specific questions about microbes, I will sit down and talk about them clearly for ages. Ooh, you have
favorite thing you learned?
Oh, I feel like I could open up to any page and be like, that is the coolest thing I learned.
My favorite anecdote in the entire book, it's like a sentence, really more even than an entire anecdote, but the guy, like, it's like one of the first stories, but he's talking about it all kind of blurs together for me, so you might have to like clarify this point. But one of the earlier scientists kept like he was writing like all sorts of weird and extra details about like the weather and like how I'm feeling that, and like the comment was basically like this guy needed a blog. I couldn't stop thinking about I don't know, just imagining 200-year-old scientists existing in the internet age.
So this is about Leon. I should know how to pronounce his last name because I always like have to make sure that I like remember. Antoine van Leeuwenhoek. I'm pretty sure that's
a bunch in the book. I just he's like super like foundational. Like if we're like talking about certain species, it's like, and I Google like history of the species, like it's like, oh, he described them in a letter to the Royal Society, and it's like very charming and like very cool. I'm just like, the man needed a blog is probably correct. I still remember like one of the first episodes I wrote was about diatoms, and he was not the guy who wrote it. The letter to the Royal Society, it was like written by like an anonymous guy. But it was just like, and then I did this thing and I wrote about like I noticed that this thing like danced around and like draws pictures and stuff. It was sort of interesting like that they described, like he kind of compared that to like an arbitrary idea of academic writing as like being very like dry. Like I think he was like putting this in contrast, but like I think that's actually not atypical for a lot of the papers that were written about that back then, because they were often like written sort of like as letters. So they're like a lot more like reading old papers. It's so much more fun than reading new papers. Like they might be longer, but like you're always just like, they wrote this in a public professional setting. Like this is so charming. To answer your question as far as like an actual thing that I learned that was interesting, the whole process with the mosquitoes at the end of the book I thought was really, really interesting. So in my person who doesn't really understand this summary of how this went down, right? This guy was like, hey, these mosquitoes that have this one microbe, if they have it, they'll die, and this microbe is like also a prominent character in the book, but has they die too soon to give people dengue fever. So if we give everybody this microbe, if we give all the mosquitoes this microbe, then they can't then we'll get rid of dengue fever. But like the problem with that is that they're all going to die too soon to like spread the microbe around. And then somebody else was like, turns out they don't actually need to die soon. They just need to have like a microbe, and like that'll be fine. And like that whole process of and it also being a thing of he had this idea and then he basically gave up on it, but he put it in front of a student and the student was like helped him figure it out. Like just that whole process for the dengue fever thing I thought was super, super interesting.
Yeah, that was really interesting. There's like a whole like controversial synthetic biology project around engineering mosquitoes to get rid of dengue fever, and it's like a whole thing about like sort of like there's multiple approaches that people take, and so like you kind of get them to like pass on genes to each other that are like gonna disrupt what's going on, and I can't remember all the specific details, but yeah, it reminded me a lot of that, but sounded less dire than whatever I remembered that like original project sounding, which was like really interesting. I think that so one non-science-y story that I personally enjoyed was about Lynn Margulis, who like I have a complicated like.
She's the one who was like, I'm right, whatever.
Yeah. Which the book glosses over this, but the things in that interview that quote comes from involve her like disputing that HIV is the cause of AIDS. So like this book glossed over just like how controversial. Again, we have a Journey to the Microcosmos episode about this because like, and this is like a deeply felt episode from all of us. I was like really interested in her because she was based in the area that like I live in, and like I had seen her name around, and then we like dove into her and like her history. She's like super important to the field, but has all of like multiple her controversy section on Wikipedia was like a concern. But one of the things that I really loved finding out was like when someone found out that like she knew their name, they were like, oh no, they're super excited. They're like, oh, Lynn Margulis knows my name. And then they're like, yeah, they said that you were wrong. She said that you were wrong. And they were like, oh, that's great news. Like that must be my odds or something. That was like probably my favorite story, against some of the backdrop of like what I know about her, but just like in general, that was like really, really funny.
Well, it does a lot of communicative work too, in terms of like what you're saying about like she's a controversial figure. Like that's a very short anecdote that like summarizes like so she's very famous. So like it's a big deal if a very famous person knows your name. But also I'm happy that she doesn't think I'm right. Like
yeah, and there was another one towards the end. Now I'm like blinking because there were so many stories. I'm like scrolling through to figure out like which ones like I found interesting. It's like, oh, that one was cool. That one was cool. Oh, I did like the mealybug that has bacteria living inside of other bacteria living inside of other bacteria. That was really
way down.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was wild.
Yeah.
And it's like all of the individual bacteria is like half an organism. It's like it got rid of all of its parts.
Yeah. Yeah. And at that point, do we call it its own thing?
This goes back to the self thing. Like, are any of these things actually their own thing if they don't have like any of the DNA that we consider necessary for being alive? They don't have it, but somehow they're alive. They're their own thing, quote unquote. I don't know, man.
Like every time you look at a chloroplast, you're looking at an example of like if you're looking at the green on a plant, like that is an example of like, he doesn't talk about it, he talks about like mitochondria, or like an example of endosymbiosis, like this one bacteria went into a cell. The other major example is chloroplasts, and like or sorry, not chloroplasts, but just like in general like photosynthetic organisms. Like it's the result of like I'm trying not to make sure I don't mess up my words, but I might be messing. The point is that a tiny blue-green thing went into another organism, and then it started making things for that organism, and they're like, cool, this is a great relationship. We're gonna like do well. I don't know. It's at what point, like now we call them chloroplasts, but like actually they were originally an organism. So like, are they still an organism who's just like really good at life and doesn't need that stuff anymore? Or like, are they an organism? Yeah.
Sorry, you were glossed over this, but going back to Laura for the mealybug specifically. So what was going on with the mealybug? Can you like summarize? Because Laura's saying that she didn't read the book.
Yeah. Okay, so
I got so excited when you said it. I was like, weird.
I'm trying to remember. Like, okay. Part of the reason why this was really, really fascinating to me is because it has to do with horizontal gene transfer, which is also like a very like mind-blowing thing in terms of how we think about like evolution. Like it's this idea that not just an idea, it's a thing that happens where genes are transferred across organisms, and like there are examples of this throughout nature, like, but most of them that we know of, like, or like it happens super commonly in microbes. And so what was fascinating here was just like how many different like organisms had transferred their genes after a certain point. I'm trying to figure.
Sorry, just to like super clarify that point. It's like not like I think I know of genes like this is I got genes from my parents and that's it, and those are my genes and that is what it is. And he describes it in the book as like the microbes are transferring genes between each other in the same way that you and I might like Venmo each other $5 back. Like, you need $5? Hey, yeah, I got $5. I'll send it to you. In the same way that microbes are like, I need the ability to break down this part of a plant. You have that. Can you hook me up with that?
Yep. Yeah, okay, so I'm remembering now like why it like blew my mind so much. Because what was really interesting is like just like what these microbes like could and couldn't do, where some of them could make some of the nutrients they need, some could make another group could make another, but none of them could make all of the things they needed. But they sort of like worked together in symbiosis in the mealybug to be able to like do it all. And like when they were looking at all of the species that were in there, they're saying like the citrus mealybug is a mashup of at least 6 different species, 5 of which are bacterial, 3 of which aren't even there. Like that to me was like, what? Like it's not even there anymore, and it's still there. Like in some ways that you can still find it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I liked how he described it, where like in terms of the arithmetic, at this point he describes like in the arithmetic of symbiosis, 1 + 1 + 1 can equal 1. Like I was like, that's a like useful way.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that would combine like both the mind-blowing nature of symbiosis with the mind-blowing nature of horizontal gene transfer, and it's just like, oh.
And like the larger sort of themes of what we think of as a single organism is actually like a system of organisms. That's like a good anecdote that like encompasses a lot of the major touchstones of the book. Unrelated to any of this, but Miriam agreeing with you that classical ecology papers are wild. Okay, new YouTube channel idea: dramatic readings of classical ecology papers.
Yes.
I haven't read any, so I actually can't tell you if this is a good idea or not. But like drunk history style classical ecology paper readings.
I really like this idea. I like the idea of going into old papers. Like I've heard this in particular about like environmental and ecology papers. Like whenever I have brought up how wild it is to read old papers, like people who like read like old like ecology environmental papers are like, oh boy, like you don't even know. And I'm like now curious because I don't know, and I'm so
right. I don't even know.
Yeah. Like I have this book called The Scientific Literature, A Guided Tour. And we're all reaching for our books.
Yeah, I got a textbook for you.
I like how we were like, I'm not sure if we know what we're going to talk about today, and now we're like reaching for books. Where is this? I gotta go to the
to that point though of like going into this not really knowing what to talk about. I like this last 10 minutes has been my favorite of parts of this conversation, because going into it I was like, I don't know what I have to say. I don't know anything about science. I like read this book and it was interesting, and now it's all gonna like leave my brain. But I like, this is like a thing to file away, maybe as a way that we frame conversations like this in the future. But Laura's question, like, I think was really, really good and interesting as an entry point into. I realized that I actually did retain a lot more of this book than I did. I just like on a purely self-interested level, I feel better.
Yeah. Next time I should have prepared a quiz. It'll be like so from this old paper, we are looking at from Leeuwenhoek. Wait, sorry, no, this might be from Flea. What we are about to look at is Flea Anatomy from Leeuwenhoek letter. Where's my camera? There's my camera. That is a specific part of the flea taken, I believe it is the genitalia, taken through the microscope. And it's one of my favorite figures ever. And it's from like this old paper from 1693 concerning the colors of parrot feathers and wool and the anatomy and copulation of fleas. So this is not a historical like rival scientist being dramatically read, though I also love that idea. There's some like really great petty moments in papers that I've looked at, like especially if you ever go, I think PNAS has like a way to look at papers that are being written in response to another one, and those are so wonderful and passive aggressive and petty, especially because they also use the passive voice. Like most of the time I hate how scientists use the passive voice, but in a rebuttal, it's amazing.
Yes. Yes.
So yes. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Old papers are the best.
I'm gonna file this away for our next pilot season.
Yes. I will work with you on this. I'm very excited.
I got a pilot idea for you.
Yep.
Great.
Cool.
Well, on that note, are we ready to wrap this up? Anything else anybody wants to ask, share, propose?
We will wait a few seconds for any pause or any lag from YouTube.
I guess while that's happening, I can tell you about the book, our next book. So our next book club will be on, I realized I should have had the date ready, October 10th. October? It's already September. Our next one is October. Yes. Okay. Anyway, our next book club will be on October 10th. And this was not intentional, but we'll be reading about the terrifying topic in honor of Halloween. Not in honor of Halloween. We're reading The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, which I will now, oh, you did it. Don't. So that's, yes.
I don't know if we're going to have a favorite thing we learned, but we will have a thing we learned. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot of things.
Yeah, this will be like, what's the most depressing thing you learned? It's probably really how this one's going to go.
Yeah. I am glad that we sort of interrupted our like depressing things with sort of like a. I needed a little bit of like relief.
Yeah, I think like as a general rule, we're probably going to skew towards the depressing, but it's always good when we can find something a little lighthearted, like microbes. It's
cracking me up. Does anyone feel like they need to eat a lot more fiber?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That was my biggest takeaway from this book was I don't get enough fiber in my diet.
Yeah.
So
we're not just eating for 1 or 2. We're eating for like a billion. Okay, you guys.
The many colonies inside my body demand more fiber.
Yep.
Yes, give me a fun book club to stream on YouTube. Yes, the little that I know of this book, doing a live stream. There's like a whole. I'm sure we'll discuss the meta elements of that.
Yep.
It'll be great. It'll be great.
We're gonna have this conversation in a cave. No one will see it. But Facebook will still find us. That will be truly the most depressing part. Cool. Yep. Awesome. Well, I guess, yeah, we're ending?
We did it. Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for joining us. We will see you October 10th.